It gives me a great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Professor Bob Lingard. Bob is Professorial Research Fellow in the School of Education at the University of Queensland, Australia. He's previously held the Andrew Bell Chair in Education at the University of Edinburgh, was a research professor at the University of Sheffield, and for a time head of the School of Education at the University of Queensland. He's the editor or author of 25 books, and if it's okay, I'll just highlight these because they're an extensive list, and we'll all have our favourite, I know. Globalising Educational Accountabilities, Rutledge, 2016. I'm sure you've got your favourite too, Bob. Co-authored with Wayne Martino and Goli Rizzo Arashti and Sam Seller. He's the sole author, of course, of Politics, Policies and Pedagogies in Education. Changing Schools was another one in 2012, co-edited with Terry Wrigley and Pat Thompson. Bob's obviously published widely, and I could go right down through the list. At the moment, also editor of the journal Discourse Studies in Cultural Politic of Education, also through Rutledge New York book series. Bob's research focuses on globalisation, education policy, the education work of the OECD, data and accountability, and school reform and social justice. And it's terrific to have you here at our conference. Thanks very much, Bob.
Thanks, Joe. I should say, my publisher always says to me, she wishes I had more brothers and sisters and my books would sell a few more copies. I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. You will see that I've changed the title fractionally, and I'm now calling it Interrogating Data for Education Policy and Educational Leadership. Now, it's a hard act to follow Ben from this morning, and Wendy told me I should channel my inner Shakespeare, but I have to say it's very deeply buried inside me, and I don't think I can. But I did, as a 14-year-old at school, study King Henry V, and I thought this might be an appropriate way to begin. Once more to the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the gap with data. One thing Ben said will resonate with what I'm going to say or try to say. He said vision should value qualities rather than quantities, and my argument would be that vision values philosophy of education, professional knowledges should sit prior to quantities and what we want to measure and what we do measure in education, rather than, I think, sometimes at the present in schooling systems right around the world and our various systems, that the data is driving what we do rather than what we want to do driving the data. And I really want to try to drive home that point quite strongly. I know the themes are creativity and innovation, the new DNA of schools, and I will allude to these ideas on the way through, but my argument will be at one level that innovation's going on behind our backs, in a way, in respect of data, and in particular in respect of data infrastructures. And I think they're impacting every day on systems, the work of principals, and particularly of teachers, and the school lives of the young people in these schools. And my central argument is that those developments need to be framed by professional knowledges, the knowledges collectively in this room, and those of the profession more broadly, of research, and a vision, a philosophy that we have about what our schools ought to be aiming to achieve today. I was passing through Melbourne Airport, and this was an advertisement. I was an English teacher 40 or so years ago, and I was always taught data was plural, but there we are. But I think data has been a game changer. So in this first section, I just want to say something about policy and data. And I want to say that I think policy, whether it's systemic within your department or within your schools, going back to this old definition, is the authoritative allocation of values. And in a book I wrote with a colleague, we argue that in today's globalised world, each aspect of that definition had been challenged. That is authority, legitimate right to exercise power. We have impacts now on our schooling systems coming from the OECD through PISA, IEAs, TIMS and PEARLs, and so on. Allocation, the state's been restructured, initially through new public management, steering at a distance through broad strategy set, and then key performance indicators, and more recently, which I'll come to, a move to more network governance, which also is rescaled across the globe with heavy involvement of edu-businesses, which is work I've been doing for a while now, with the state in producing policy, which raises sets of questions about what public education is today and what it ought to be, and values, of course, ideology, philosophy. But we have all of this talk at this very moment, not just here, right around our globe, of evidence-based policy, particularly in education. And my argument will be that we can only ever have, and we ought only ever have, evidence-informed policy. That evidence, whether it be data or research, can't tell us what to do and ought not try to tell us what to do in professional practice terms, whether you're the principal or a teacher or me working in the university. And one of my UQ colleagues, a political scientist who was head of the Public Service Commission in Queensland, wrote a very influential paper a few years ago where he was thinking about research, relationships to policy, and I would now say that I think data, rather than research, has become more influential in the production of public policy, particularly in education. And his argument is that all policy is this hybrid mix, this melange, if you like, of political judgment, professional practice and scientific research or data. So there's policy is the authoritative allocation of values. There's always the value, the philosophy there. Then there's the knowledges that you all have, which becomes part of policy and education, and then the data. And this is why, and those mixes, of course, are different for different policies and whether we're looking at systems or schools. But this is why I would argue we can only ever have evidence-informed policy. And it's our values which should frame up the evidence we collect, which will then help us interrogate and think about our professional practice, which of course is part of the policy mix, professional knowledges. And good policy making, I think, includes the knowledge in this room in the policy production. Otherwise, if it's simply top down one way, we know what happens in the process to enactment. Another way of representing what I just said, and replace research with data, it can work across that continuum in terms of its impact, from awareness right through to the impact upon policy and practice, on practice. My point is, what do we see is our goals for schooling at the systemic level and at your school level? And of course, if we look at the Melbourne Declaration that you all know well, 9 years old now, developed out of a political process rather than so much with this sort of education policy community, and it argues certain things. And I think the second statement there, schools play a vital role in promoting the intellectual, physical, social, emotional, moral, spiritual and aesthetic development. I mean, we have big things on our shoulders, but I put alignments there because if I think about the message systems of schooling, curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and assessment as well as testing. Think of testing. And I'm not saying that we ought to have tests for all of those things, but we only test some things. And I think we need to be careful of not reading the results of certain tests as a measure of the quality of the school or a schooling system or of all of the work you do. This agreed set of goals for Australian schools is much broader than some of the things we give emphasis to in testing, which is not to say the testing things are not important, and it's not to imply that we should add tests to all of those other domains, but I think we just need to keep in mind those broader set of goals. I mean, if we look at the two specific goals for Australian schools, schooling promotes equity and excellence, well, what are they? And look, I have a much greater preference for social justice over equity. I've written a bit about this. I think equity comes out of a business model. It's a narrower construction, and I would want to push us to a broader construction of that idea of equity. And we could spend a long time talking about it. I won't. All young Australians become successful learners, confident and creative individuals, active and informed citizens. How does what we do in the system and how we measure what we do and what we achieve, how does that align with or not align with what we say our framing goals are? I put this quote up from Richard Elmore, famous policy theorist in education at Harvard, who's the guy who developed the idea of backward mapping. He says the best systemic policy comes from looking at the smallest units in schools and developing policy back that way. But I put in bold this bit. He said he used to think policy was the solution to everything. Now he's sceptical, and he says the result is an education sector that is overwhelmed with policy, conditioned to respond to the immediate demands of whoever controls the political agenda, and not in investing in the long-term health of the sector and the people who work in it. That is, learning from you and having your contribution to the development of systemic policy. And I think one of the issues here are the multiple temporalities at work. You know, the political cycles in Australia are very short, whereas if you go in as a principal of a school and want to change it, that time frame's hugely different from what the political, and those temporalities, I think, lead us to a whole lot of problems. Now, I want to come to the data bit of this, and I'm not trying to be esoteric here, and I just want to make these distinctions because I want to drive home the point that data is not given, it's made, it's constructed, but it does reflect some reality. I'll come to that. So Galloway has recently argued that we should distinguish between data, and one of the things happening in the contemporary world through the digital age is the datification of the world. He then says out of all that data, some of it is selected and becomes capta, and from that we get what he calls information. And this is driving home the point about the social processes in the construction of data, which I think we need to think about. T.S. Eliot in The Rock asks, where is the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we've lost in information? And that goes to my point about our philosophical frame, our set of values and goals driving our data collection and what we're doing. And of course, data is always a selection. I love this quote from Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, and he talks about trying to get a perfect measure, and it's from a short story by Borges. A layman's version of the de facto impossibility of ever achieving a complete a measure of any given system is provided in a note by Borges. An emperor wishes to have a perfectly accurate map of the empire made. The project leads the country to ruin. The entire population devotes all of its time to cartography. We can't have perfect measures. We've got selective, and I think we need to think about those technical elements that go into constructing the numbers, particularly single numbers. Nicholas Rose here in this quote says the power of the single figure is a rhetorical technique for black boxing. So the nation gets its PISA score, it gets its TIMS score, the state gets it, and we just take that as a given. He's saying there's all this technical selective work, and I've become really interested in that. You might have seen the Shanghai Jiangtao rankings of universities. ANU went from 77 last time to 97. Why? Because they lost one high citation scholar. You know, nothing's really changed at ANU, but it seems like it's falling down the league tables. It's a question of what you're measuring, right? And how it's valued in that particular measure. And the last bit of this quote is also interesting, I think. The apparent facticity of the figure obscures the complex technical work that is required to produce objectivity. And I just wanted to give an example and take it from test and assessment theory, this idea of differential item function. You know the PISA tests, maths literacy, scientific literacy and reading literacy, which are trying to measure the capacity of 15-year-olds in 2015 in 71 systems on the planet, trying to measure their capacity to apply knowledge in real-life situations. Well, you think of it, 71 nations, different languages, so there's translations of the test items. So what goes on in the 3-year cycle is 2 years of trialling the test. So the test gets trialled in many nations on the planet. Then when the results come in and we find that all the Chinese kids get that one right and all the New Zealanders get that one wrong, they get cut out of the test because the OECD says that picks up cultural differences and we're trying to get rid of cultural differences. And so what they're doing is trying to create isomorphism. They're creating the globe as a commensurate space, but there's a whole lot of work that goes into creating the test so they get a mean score across the whole sample of 500, and so that they don't have any outlier nations. A good example of the technical work that goes into the construction of the number. Now, it could go on at great length about that, and there's some incredibly interesting stuff. And one of my colleagues who knows much more about this than I showed me a question that the kids in Shanghai got wrong, and she's a Mandarin speaker, and she showed me it was simply a mistranslation of the question. You know, so there's a whole lot of complex work. And that's true of all the tests, NAPLAN included, and we need to keep that in mind. So we shouldn't bow down in front of these things. We understand what they are, I hope. And this is to make the point in a more academic way, that data are both constructed and reflecting some reality. So we have something called poverty, we have a measure of it. We have something called unemployment, we have a measure of it. But if we measure it in different ways, we'll get different amounts. And we need to keep that in mind. The Richard Selleck, I think, data are not given, they are made. Data are not given, they are made. I always loved it when I was an undergraduate when Durkheim said that as a sociologist, which I am, you have to treat social facts as things and constructions. You know, and the most amazing thing about Durkheim, of course, was showing the patterns in suicide rates, that in European countries, people who didn't have tight family relations committed suicide at Christmas. So there's something beyond the individual involved, those sorts of social patterns. Magritte, this is not a pipe. So NAPLAN literacy is not literacy, it's a particular measure of literacy at a particular moment. This is not literacy, it's a representation at that moment of some elements which are... Do you understand the point I'm making? And of course, literacy and reading, how they go together or don't go together. So this is the point about data being made. The next slide I'm going to put up from Lunig goes to the core of what I'm trying to say, and I think to the core of your themes about creativity and innovation as well. You know, the unique person and then the statistical person. Now, man, I think, is, you know, they're chosen as generic, but maybe there's some masculinist element in these sorts of measures as well. But the statistical measures put us into categories. You know, what I do as a sociologist of education is look at what collective characteristics of individual students, these are working class students, Indigenous girls who are poor. You put people into categories. And out of that comes, when you tie it into testing and other sets of data, is a form of standardisation. And we need, and the people who are big in data and testing would argue that in the future, with computer adaptive testing, online testing, with computer marking of essays, I always think we should give them James Joyce's Ulysses and have the computer to mark that, that there's categories here. And how do these two things, and this is what we have to work together in our minds, what you might see as looking and working with the individual student against our data, which is the student as a member of broader sort of categories, and how do those things work together? Now, I want to become a bit more academic, if you'll allow me, don't throw things, for a moment, and look at the context of this. And I always loved Raymond Williams' way of talking about the world at any moment, about a structure of feeling. And in some ways that tries to grasp some things we can't quite grasp semantically at a particular time. I mean, how do we understand the world at this minute? I don't know. I wake up every morning and think. I'm a post-war baby boomer. This seems to me to be the worst moment, broadly speaking. And think about it. We had the end of the Cold War, the opening up of a sort of neoliberal globalisation. We had the global financial crisis. And then I think what we've got now is the afterburn of all of that. Because there has been growing inequality, and the responses to it have been totally inappropriate, in my view, you know, Trump and Brexit. But I understand what their response is to. And that context plays into our schools as well, and should be part of how we look at data, and I'll come back to that in a moment as well. So Lyotard, and he wrote this quite a long time ago, The Postmodern Condition. He argued that meta-narratives were dead, and I suppose you could see the end of the Cold War, meta-narratives as dead. What drives systems? And he argued, some time ago now, that the way systems keep going, being operational or commensurable, is through sort of input-output equations. And so he would argue that's the move. And you might see the whole datification, the data revolution, the future or current moves to big data in that context. And performativity becomes an element here that he wrote about. So being seen to perform, students being seen to perform, teachers, principals, that set of things, rather than some of the matters that Ben talked about this morning. And Stephen Ball says in this context of performativity, the issue is who controls the field of judgment. And I've had the pleasure for the last couple of years of researching with a Japanese colleague in Japan. And what's amazing to me in Japan is they have national tests, but they're set by people called instructional advisors. So the way to career preferment in the Japanese schooling system is to be an outstanding teacher. You get promoted to the system. You then work on the construction of the national tests, and then you go back into a school as a deputy. And there's other matters there which put pedagogy at the core of what they do. Lesson study, for example. I've just been in Japanese schools where all the Year 4 teachers in a primary school were viewed by the principal, all the other Year 4 teachers, and 3 principals from elsewhere, and someone in the ministry. Then for 3 hours after school, they had this productive, supportive, caring conversation about the pedagogical practices. It took me aback. And the national test in Japan is marked by the teachers of the class that take the test. Then what goes back to the schools, these instructional advisors go through, analyse which questions kids got right and wrong, and then write up pedagogical strategies in response to every question. Now, there's a way in which our NAPLAN doesn't quite allow that, and who controls the field of judgment. But in Japan, there's emerging, in a little way, some of the move to psychometricians, test companies, and so on. doing the tests, but there's huge resistance because the teachers want to control the field of judgment. And I think what teachers do is at the core of leadership practices in the school, but also the system. If you talk to people in the ministry, they talk about pedagogy in a way I don't find that to be the case elsewhere. So part of that structure of feeling. Now this move from government to governance, new public management, so the old bureaucratic post-war welfare state got rid of, steering at a distance, big strategies and key performance indicators. Then the subsequent move to network governance. This quote I have here, in the world of network governance, government is understood to be located alongside business and civil society actors in a complex game of public policy formation, decision-making and implementation. And when I come in a moment to talk about data infrastructures, you will see that playing out in Australia. And I think it's a case of this playing out behind our backs in a way. I haven't found very many people that know anything about what's going on in relation to that in the Australian context. Jenny Osger has said data production and management are essential to this new governance. Governance is through comparison, like school measures, PISA, international league tables. And Martin Lawn has argued that what they have in England in terms of schools and such diversities, academies, free schools, multiple kinds of government schools, is basically a systemless system that's structured only around data, and that those in the central office have all the data and can gaze out, but those in bits of it. And I don't want us to go down that route. I think we've got to really halt any move in that direction so that we can work together rather than be in competition with the school down the road, so that we can share, learn from each other and so on. The rain came. It's quite noisy from up here. I don't know what it's like down there. And look, I don't want to say anything about this, but I think one of the things that's happened with policy, it's basically policy as numbers. Like policy is a network of numbers connecting those exercising political power with the persons, processes and problems that they seek to govern. We've got this sort of grey sciences of the data, and where our professional practices, your professional practices fit into this. And what I'm saying, it's your knowledges and our commitment to a set of goals, socially just goals for the schooling system, that should drive the policy and the data that we collect and allow us to reflect upon how well we are doing. So I want to say something now about data infrastructures. Has anyone in the room heard of the National Schools Interoperability Program? Anybody? NICEP? Yeah? There's someone over there. Must be a nerd like me. Let me say something about this. Data infrastructures are becoming more and more important in structuring schooling systems as data and our computational capacities and so on have got larger. Now, I talked about network governance, and Kelly Easterling has written a brilliant, brilliant book about infrastructures. And all of it applies to what I want to say about data infrastructures and the way standardisation and national developments in federal structures open up spaces with the restructured state for edgy businesses. And I've been researching New York State for the last few years. And it's the sort of, even though there's now huge resistance to it, but it's the sort of end point where large edgy businesses really construct policy, frame up all elements of it in partnership with the state-level government. But whether that's what, in a democracy, public education ought to be, is another question. So what you see with this, what Easterling calls extra statecraft, is the big ed tech companies, the big edgy businesses in partnership with departments of education, structuring and underpinning data infrastructure for the system. Now, how does this work? Standardisation is central to it. How does that tie with creativity and innovation? In 1999, Bill Gates launched SIF, Systems Interoperability Framework. This is a framework so all software, hardware, data programs can be used interoperably, if that's such a word. And finally, in 2003, the US federal department went into partnership with Gates on this SIF, and they endorsed SIF for all of the software and hardware used across the entire schooling system of the USA, a form of network governance. In the UK, they agreed to SIF standards in 2006, and the Intergovernmental Council here of Education Ministers agreed and endorsed SIF in 2009. There's a global association now of which Australia is a member, USA and the UK. And it asserts that this is the most comprehensive data model, mature infrastructure, interoperability framework in use globally in education. I mean, the EU is going to pick it up, it'll be picked up in Asia, and can you see the size of the market that this then gives to the edgy business, the ed tech industries, and the focus on standardisation and data, and how's that, and where do we fit into that, and what do we know about that? If we look at the Australian context, as I said, the Intergovernmental Council endorsed the National Schools Interoperability Framework, as did the Catholic systems and the independent schools, all the state systems and the federal department. And that program is overseen by a Chief Information Officer who heads up NICEP in the Intergovernmental Council office in Melbourne. And he meets with the Chief Information Officers of the other systems. And the danger here is that the technical, the computational, will drive what data we have rather than us. Do you get the point I'm making? And we don't know. And these are good people. We wrote a paper, an op-ed piece in the Sydney Morning Herald a couple of months ago about the dangers around privacy here. And they got very upset with us because they're good people, but there's been very little acknowledgement of the work that's going on in this space behind our backs, as it were. And what you see if you go to the National Schools Interoperability Framework is that all the ed tech industries are there with the office in Melbourne. And standardisation is important here. So what is this SIF? The Systems Interoperability Framework, and I've taken this from their website, widely known as SIF, is an international specification for the exchange of school data. You can see how international data can be filtered through this as well. The SIF Association is made up of education providers, state systems, Catholic, independent and software vendors who have a common interest in having software applications interact and share data. And that might be a good thing, but who's driving it? You know, what set of goals around education are driving it? What is the education input? What is the professional education's input? I'm going to click to the next slide just for a little 2-minute video, which is on the National Schools Interoperability Framework. And you can see where they're hoping that this will go. I mean, the long-term hope is that there'll be live data fed into every classroom where teachers have got live data on each and every individual child in the classroom. And there will be pedagogical advice which is attached to this. Now, I have to say, to be fair, that the NCIP people are very aware of the potential privacy issues. And one of the reasons is a case in the US, which I'll come to in a moment.
Australian students are using online learning resources more than ever before. A revolution in learning, school administration and parent communication is underway, driven by digital technologies. With the powerful growth of learning platforms and online education services available, educators need digital tools that work together locally and between organisations if technology is to truly contribute to raising educational achievement. Digital education is powered by data. Through the formation of the National Schools Interoperability Program, NSIP, education authorities are working together and with industry to improve the way computer systems exchange data based on open standards. SIF, the Systems Interoperability Framework, has been endorsed by state, territory and federal ministers of education as the preferred standard for exchanging data between systems and organisations. SIF provides an agreed data model that can be understood across Australia and internationally. SIF also supports secure options for data transport and is compatible with other standards, providing access and transport for the data needed for assessments, homework, results and reporting. Interoperability provides educators with access to accurate information drawn from across the breadth of online systems, and different systems can then be automatically kept up to date. This means a reduction of logins and the entering of data, and more time for analysing and planning, getting real-time understanding that leads to actionable results. NSIP is helping to create a digital learning ecosystem, enabling students, teachers, parents and policymakers to access the information they need when and where they need it. Working with schools, school authorities and the IT industry to support unprecedented transfer of knowledge, NSIP is targeting improved outcomes for learners, schools and school systems. The National Schools Interoperability Program, putting the right information in the right place at the right time.
Okay, I just want to speak very briefly about a case in the US which I think has been very important to the people who've developed the framework, the program in Australia. President Obama, as part of his race to the top, required all systems in the US to build data infrastructures. Edgy businesses, including Pearson, negotiated with 11 eastern states to create In Bloom, which was going to be a data infrastructure which integrated all data on young people across the silos of government, from schools, departments, and so on. And what happened, 100 million was put in by the Gates Foundation to develop this, and Bill Gates said this was necessary for schooling systems of the 21st century. But parents got up in arms about this because a private company was going to have access to all this data from the cradle and across all departments through to schooling. And the parents were deeply concerned that there would be the sale of this to third parties for other usages, you know, a big data set, as it were. And this actually defeated In Bloom, despite the 100 million and from the Gates Foundation, because of these deep concerns about the privacy of the data, it collapsed. And there's been some interesting stuff written about that. And when my colleagues interview the people who are responsible for the program in Australia, they are deeply aware of what happened here, and they are trying to be scrupulously careful about privacy issues. But there are privacy issues when private businesses are providing the data infrastructures. And I think I've said enough about that. So look, I just want to make this caveat, and it's a really big one. I'm not opposed to quantitative data. I'm not opposed to data for policy making, but it can always, ought to be, evidence-informed policy, data-informed policy, not based, because our values, purposes and policy need to drive the data. I am opposed to a sort of naive neo-positivism around data driving policy, and I think some of the big data stuff You know, my wife was talking about buying a new car, so I was looking at this car online. Every time I go onto Google now, down the sign, lo and behold, come the car and where I can buy it. And this is the image they have in mind for what will happen with our classrooms. It's happening in universities with data analytics. You can have kids responding while you're giving a lecture. No, young people, they're not kids. They seem like kids to me. But that then you get feedback on. So I'm opposed to that naive neo-positivism. But I make this point, and Thomas Piketty in his best-selling Inequality in the 21st Century, the last sentence in that book is this one: refusing to deal with numbers rarely serves the interests of the least well-off. And I think that's right. We know about the correlation between social class background and performance because of big data sets and correlations. We know it from NAPLAN data. We know it from PISA data. But often we don't look at that data. If you look at the way the media responds to PISA, or indeed Tims and Pearls or NAPLAN, the lack of sophistication and the representation. Like if you look at PISA, what does it really show about Australia? It shows the strengthening correlation of performance in Australia with SES background. No one wants to confront that. The media, it's never mentioned. It's just where we stand in global league tables. The same, of course, with NAPLAN. I've just read Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. She's a mathematician, and she critiques algorithms and big data, arguing that they'll lead to more inequality if they're bad algorithms and badly driven, and will be anti-democratic. And she says the thing about big data, it is all the data, of course, what's happened in the past. And how do we move to the future? Only on the basis of that set of data, or do we need to break with that and go somewhere else? So I hope you're grasping what I'm trying to say about data. Data per se isn't bad. It's why we collect it and what we do with it. And to understand all, and I think there are far too many people in our nation. Japan, every person there I interview in my studies there talk about there's 3 psychometricians in all of Japan. Now, that can give them an awful lot of power in terms of test construction, and I think we and our profession needs to keep an eye on how tests are constructed, how the stats work around this, and so on. Okay, to come and look at some data. The first piece of data, and I think the secondary data of the OECD's PISA, Program for International Student Achievement, is good and interesting data. And I always thought this table in a report on 2012 PISA, which was looking at the relationship between performance on PISA, and what's important about PISA is that the high-performing nations also are the most equitable. That is, there's the weakest relationship to the background of the kids, which of course is a Gonski aspiration as well, 1.0 and 2.0. But what this shows is the systems that have the most equitable funding are those that get the best results, right? And it's a sort of no-brainer to us in a way, but we still have to argue the case. But I want to just go one step on, and this is my point about what we believe in, what our philosophy, what goals, etc., we want from schooling. I just wanted to say something about Gonski. So we had Gonski 1.0, which was disaffected, I think, by the politics and an election that got in the way. We've got Gonski 2.0, and you might want to argue there's not enough money, but I think it's an acceptance of the principles, and that is a very a big positive. And the best evidence shows that in schooling systems which are high quality and high equity, you spend a threshold amount per student to there, and then what matters is the extra money being redistributed to the schools serving the poorest communities, yeah? And Gonski's got that. But I think one of the dangers we're facing at this moment is that we can't just get this extra billions of dollars and keep on doing what we're doing. This is where creativity and innovation comes in. And I think there has to be systemic intervention. I don't think we can just have the extra money go to schools and the schools do what they do. I've just examined a PhD thesis about reading intervention programs in 3 schools in Queensland, where what they did was employ heaps and heaps of teacher aides. But what the study shows was, because in Queensland there were these statewide targets set for improving outcomes, that the teachers kept the high-performing kids in the class, those kids they thought that could improve, and those that went to the teacher aides were those who were performing poorly and high-performing kids who behaved badly. And the argument of the thesis is that it sort of had no impact, really, on pulling up. And I think my point about Gonski, or indeed systemic literacy programs, is that we have to have them as research-informed. I was involved some years ago in Queensland, some of you might remember, the new basics reform around a curriculum and productive pedagogies that we developed. And the great thing about that reform was the 50 schools, Anna Bligh was the minister, and she was fantastic. She had a critical friend and researcher in every one of those schools, and they reflected upon and evaluated. And I think with Gonski, the money's there, but what is the biggest bang for that buck? Where and how? And I think we have to look to research, we've got to share resources, we've got to talk across each other, and so on. See, if you go back, Whitlam, needs-based approach, but he had the disadvantaged schools program, so there was the funding plus a targeted program. Or under Rudd and Gillard, you had the national partnerships, which there was the hope for the redistributive funding and the targeted programs. And I think we, collectively, all of you, systems, have to think in great detail about what is the best way to use Gonski money. And we should keep in mind the social justice, equity matters. Now, PISA, I just put this up, and I'm putting a whole lot of data up now, and I'll rush through this because I know I'm supposed to be finished. Yeah, 5 minutes. Basically to make one point, and a few others, but one big point is all these state comparisons that we do on NAPLAN and do on PISA and TIMSS and PIRLS, I mean, statistically are spurious because they're not commensurate spaces. Now, the Northern Territory is not Victoria, is not Tasmania, is not South Australia. I mean, we've got ICSIA to measure like schools. If the comparisons of states were to be valid, you'd have to have some taking account of the specificities. And I think this is very true within states and across regions. If you look at this, you could see South Australia is absolutely average on the last PISA on science, no different from the OECD average in terms of score or the impact of SES. Victoria was the only state that was better than the average in terms of performance and a lesser impact of SES. Whereas if you look at the Northern Territory and Tasmania in that left quadrant, the social class impact, and I've looked at the Tasmanian data, the correlation between social class and performance in Tasmania is exceedingly strong. And it seems to me at the state level around Gonski, you'd have to do something different from what you might do in Victoria. And we need sophisticated data and sophisticated reading of this data. This plots the strength of the correlation to SES on science and the 2015 PISA. And the ACT has a strong correlation, but it's with the upper end of social class, whereas you can see Victoria and South Australia sit well. A weaker impact of SES on performance than in all the other parts of Australia, apart from Victoria, which is interesting. What does that tell us? What could the other states and territories and systems learn from that? And I just put this up. This is the quartiles of social class, economic and cultural that OECD uses. And if you look at any measure, NAPLAN, PISA, ACT of the Australian jurisdictions performs highest. It also has more high-income earners, more... So if you look at the top, you can see whatever those two figures are, 70% are in the top 2 quartiles, whereas if you look at South Australia, it's a different situation, Northern Territory and Tasmania. We need to take those things into account in terms of our data. Now look, I've got a whole range more slides. I'll try to just bring this to a close. One of the things I would say about PISA and the OECD is that it overplays the significance of policy, even though all of its data shows the significance of social class, SES background. And those systems which are in countries with higher GDPs and spend more on education, that accounts for quite a lot of the differences in performance across nations. And the Gini coefficient, the extent of inequality in a nation, correlates very strongly with performance on PISA. So Finland, that did very well for a long time, has a low Gini coefficient, only government schools, and a whole range of other systemic features as well. If I could just rush through this, I put this data up because I could get it from 2009. The children of Chinese-born parents in Australia perform on PISA similar to the way kids in Shanghai perform on PISA, and much better than the whole Australian sample. The same's true in New Zealand, which says there's something about culture, not just the school, linked to performance here. The Gini coefficient, you can see the Scandinavians more equal, Australia sitting there in the middle. I think this is important. In 1980, the Gini coefficient in Australia was 0.27, it's 0.33. The society's become more unequal. I haven't got time to get through it, but if you look at the Gini coefficients of all the states, there's growing inequality, and that's different in different states, and that plays into schooling systems. Let me just show you some of the data about the state, and I'll draw this to a close then. If you look at changes in gross state product, you can see South Australia compared with the rest of Australia. No. If you look at the distribution of income, compare ACT, say, with South Australia. South Australia doesn't have as many high income earners and has more at the lower end. These are factors that play into what happens in schooling. That's those things divided across 3 areas of Tasmania to the extent I could pull it out of the census. And you can see remote, regional, not as well off. What does that mean in terms of our policies and what we do and how we target at regions? This is unemployment across Australia, South Australia, the highest. This is across the regions, and you can see the disparity there. How does that play into schools and opportunities for young people? And they're the Gini coefficients. But to try just to bring this to a close, these are the points I want to make. We can be creative and innovative with our current data, and I know many of you are. But I think we have to participate in a debate and discussion that professional knowledge, a philosophy of education, a commitment to social justice need to frame the data that are collected, and then what we measure to see whether we are achieving what we want to achieve. Rather, I think what's happening at the moment is those things are being reconstituted through data. And I think the reconstitution, if you take ICSIA and like schools, responsibilises principals, teachers and schools. So your like school measure putatively holds context constant. So the difference in performance between you and the 59, your school and the 59 others, is totally down to what you do. There's a responsibilising, but I would argue strongly that schools are deeply socially embedded, and that if you take John Hattie's visible learning, and I've had these discussions and debates with him, that he says in the preface to his book, poverty, ill health, inequality, all of those things have more impact than the classroom, but we can only deal with the classroom. Now, I think the argument's wrong. I think schools need to be embedded in their communities more, and the communities in schools, and that we need sophisticated data about that. And we can get sophisticated data at the school site. So that we need to retether the data we collect, the way we evaluate and measure your achievements or otherwise. We need to retether that data to our broad set of goals. And it might be, I think it probably is, a time to revisit the Melbourne Declaration and have more of the profession involved in that. But they're the things. And then at your school, vision, mission, call it what you will, how that ought to link to the sorts of data. And of course, there is narrative data. And I haven't got time to talk about that, but in a big project we did with a group of 12 schools in regional Queensland, we had them developing narratives on a yearly basis of the things they had achieved in consultation with their communities. And the communities thought that that was much more useful than NAPLAN scores or my school, which is really interesting to me. So that I think you make a difference. Teachers make a difference. We have to maximise what difference schools make, what principals make, what teachers make. But you can't make all the difference. And I think some of the data we currently have almost suggests that it's what you do and what the teachers do that makes all the difference. And I want to say we have to have a more sophisticated account. I mean, there's so much research, so much sociology of education that shows that background matters. So how can the school work with that? And how can our data reflect that complexity of the relational to the community? So I hope I've got my message across. Thank you very much.